Be me, Kai, senior consultant at a mid-sized but pretty successful firm. Jobs what you'd expect. High pressure, long hours, but good pay and interesting problems to solve. Our department is the core of the company, the one that brings in the big clients. The work is pure meritocracy. You're good at what you do. You're respected. You're not, you're gone. No room for drama, no time for nonsense. We're a well-oiled machine. My immediate team is small but sharp. There's Emmett. He's been with the firm since it was founded in a garage. He's seen it all, done it all. Doesn't say much, but when he does, everyone listens. He has this sixth sense for sniffing out a bad business decision from a mile away. Then there's Yosef. He's a young guy, barely out of his 20s, but he's a wizard with data. Give him a chaotic spreadsheet and a vague goal, and he'll come back in an hour with a model that tells you things you didn't even know you should be asking. Quiet, intense, and always 5 steps ahead. The rest of the guys are similar, competent, professional, zero fluff. We work, we solve problems, we go home. It's a good system. It works. We consistently outperform every other department. I remember a few months back, we had this huge project for a major logistics client. Their whole supply chain was on the verge of collapse, and they were losing millions a day. Panic stations everywhere. The client sends us terabytes of disorganized data. Nobody knows where to start. Emmett takes one look at the initial report, just skims it for maybe 5 minutes, and points to one specific region. He says something like, he's seen a pattern like this before, back in the dot-com bust, a supplier issue masquerading as a distribution problem. While the rest of us are trying to wrap our heads around that, Yosef has already pulled the data for that region and is running it through some custom script. He doesn't even talk, just furiously types. The screen is a blur of code and numbers. An hour later, he puts a single chart up on the main screen. It's beautiful in its simplicity. It shows one single supplier consistently missing delivery windows by a few hours, creating a cascading failure down the entire line. It was so small, it was lost in the noise of the bigger data set. I take that chart, build a presentation around it, and by the end of the day, we're on a conference call with the client's CEO. We laid it out clean and simple. Here's your problem, here's the proof, and here are 3 ways to fix it by the end of the week. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. They'd had internal teams working on this for a month with no progress. We saved them. That's what we do. No politics, no feelings. Just cold, hard results. That's the environment. Professional respect earned through competence. And then she arrived. It started, as these things always do, with an all-staff email. Excited to welcome our new head of human resources. The email was a wall of text filled with all the right buzzwords. Synergy, paradigm shift, people-centric, forward-thinking. Attached was a picture, a woman in her mid-30s with a very polished corporate smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name was Liliana. Her bio was impressive if you liked fluff. Lots of keynote speeches at HR conferences, articles written for industry blogs, and a background that seemed more focused on activism than on actual business administration. Yosef looked her up online and quietly sent a link to the team chat. Her social media was a masterclass in corporate ideology. Lots of posts about dismantling structures and challenging norms. Emmett leaned back in his chair, read the email on his screen, and just made a low grunting sound. He said he'd seen her type before. All theory, no practice. Thinks a business is a social experiment, not a system for generating profit. We all felt it. A quiet shift in the office atmosphere. The first sign of a storm on a clear day. For the first few weeks, things were quiet. She was probably observing and integrating. The first actual change was small. Another all-staff email. Subject: updating our communications policy for a more inclusive workspace. It was a mandate to include personal pronouns in our email signatures, not optional, mandatory. It was a minor annoyance, but everyone just did it. It wasn't a hill worth dying on, just another piece of corporate procedure. I added mine, sent a test email, and forgot about it. But it was a sign, a test of compliance. Next came the office decor. One Monday morning, we walked in, and the portraits of the company's founders were gone from the main lobby. They were old guys, sure, but they built this place from nothing. Their pictures were a part of the company's identity. In their place were generic, soulless pieces of abstract art, splashes of color on a white canvas, the kind of thing you buy in bulk to fill empty wall space. Emmett walked past, glanced at the new art, and muttered something about history being erased by people who never built anything. Liliana sent out an email later that day, explaining the change. She wrote that the old portraits did not reflect the diversity of our modern team, and that the new art was meant to be universally welcoming and non-representational. We were no longer a company with a history. We were a blank canvas for her to paint on. Then the educational materials started arriving in our inboxes. At first, it was a weekly newsletter from the HR department. It was full of links to articles and videos. Understanding Your Privilege, a guide to recognizing microaggressions. Why meritocracy can be a harmful myth. Each one was a subtle attack on the very principles our department, and the company as a whole, was built on. I'd just delete them, but the subject lines were impossible to ignore, a constant low-level hum of accusation. Some of the younger guys in other departments started talking about it by the coffee machine. A few were true believers, nodding along with every new email. Most just seemed confused and kept their heads down, not wanting to become a target. My team just ignored it. We had work to do. We were hitting our targets, keeping clients happy. This was all just background noise, or so we thought. Liliana's next move was more direct. She introduced an anonymous feedback and safety portal, an online form where anyone could submit a complaint about anything or anyone, with the promise of absolute anonymity. She announced it in a meeting with a whole speech about creating psychological safety and providing a voice for the voiceless. Emmett almost coughed up his coffee. He later told me that, in his experience, anonymous complaint boxes only do one thing: breed paranoia and become a weapon for personal vendettas. For a month, nothing seemed to come of it. The portal was just a link on the company intranet. And then Liliana called a company-wide town hall meeting. Attendance was mandatory. She stood at the front of the conference room with a presentation on the screen behind her. The first slide read, "Findings from our safety portal, a path forward." She proceeded to spend the next 20 minutes talking about the concerning feedback she had received. It was all incredibly vague. No specifics, no departments, no names. She spoke of a culture of fear, where some employees felt unheard or uncomfortable. She mentioned that some team dynamics were perceived as exclusionary and that a dominant culture was making it hard for others to contribute. The whole time she was talking, she kept glancing over at our department. We were all sitting together. It wasn't subtle. We were the most successful team, we were a tight-knit unit, and we were all male. In her eyes, that made us the dominant culture. Yosef leaned over to me and whispered that without data, feedback is just gossip. He asked where the metrics were, the specific examples. But this wasn't about data, it was about narrative. Liliana concluded her presentation with a promise. She said that based on this vital feedback, HR was developing a new comprehensive training initiative, an initiative to recenter the company's values and ensure every single employee is an active and educated ally. That was the first time we heard the word ally. It sounded like a threat. The email landed in our inboxes the following week. Subject: Mandatory Workshop. Synergistic Allyship for a Progressive Workspace. The email explained that every employee would be required to attend a 3-hour workshop. The workshop would cover topics like systemic privilege, toxic masculinity, and the role of an ally in dismantling oppressive structures within the workplace. My blood ran cold when I read toxic masculinity. This wasn't about professional development anymore. This was ideological re-education. But the worst part was at the very bottom of the email. It stated that at the conclusion of the workshop, all male staff would be required to sign a document. It was called the Pledge of Allyship. The email said this pledge was a demonstration of commitment and a foundational step in rebuilding trust within our corporate community. There was a link to a preview of the pledge. I clicked it. My stomach tightened as I read the text. It was a page of carefully crafted corporate speak, but the message was clear. It contained clauses where the signatory had to acknowledge their unearned privileges due to their gender. There was a commitment to actively step back in meetings to amplify marginalized voices. There was a promise to interrogate one's own unconscious biases and accept feedback on them without defensiveness. The most insidious part was a line stating that the signatory understood that their intent did not matter as much as their impact on others. It was a blank check for anyone to claim offense and have it be validated by default. It was a loyalty oath, an admission of guilt for a crime you didn't commit. I looked up from my screen. Across the desk pod, I saw Emmett's face. It was like granite. He'd finished reading it too. Yosef was staring at his monitor, not moving. He was probably already dissecting the legal implications of every single sentence. This was it. The final move. All the small things, the pronouns, the posters, the newsletters, it was all just groundwork for this moment. This wasn't a request. It was a demand for submission. A demand to trade our professional integrity for ideological purity. And it was mandatory. A quiet understanding passed between the men in my team without a single word being spoken. The machine had just been given a handful of sand. The day of the workshop arrived. The air in the office was thick with tension. Liliana had booked the largest conference room for the entire day, splitting the company into morning and afternoon sessions. Our department was scheduled for the afternoon. The women went in the morning session. When they came out, their expressions were a mix of things. Some looked self-righteous, others just looked bored and glad it was over. One or two seemed vaguely uncomfortable. My team spent the morning working. Nobody mentioned the upcoming session, but nobody was focused either. It was like waiting for a dental appointment you know is going to be painful. At 1 p.m., we all filed into the conference room. The lights were dimmed. Liliana stood at the front, smiling that same smile from her corporate headshot. Next to her was a woman she introduced as a special consultant, an expert in workplace dynamics and equity. For the next 2.5 hours, we were subjected to a relentless barrage of accusations dressed up as education. The consultant talked about men's conversational dominance, about how we interrupt more, take up more space. She put up slides with statistics that had no sources listed. She told anecdotes about anonymous men at other companies who had said or done the wrong thing, and then framed these stories as universal truths about male behavior. It was a masterclass in collective guilt. Every statement was designed to make us feel defensive, to put us on the back foot. The guys were silent, stone-faced. Nobody took the bait. Nobody argued. We just sat there and let it wash over us. There was a point where the consultant tried to get us to participate in a role-playing exercise. She wanted us to act out scenarios of problematic workplace behavior. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. She tried to coax us, saying it was a safe space. The silence in the room was so heavy you could feel it. It wasn't angry silence. It was the silence of complete and total non-participation. It was the sound of men who had checked out. After a few painfully awkward moments, she gave up and just skipped to the next section of her presentation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the educational part was over. Liliana stepped forward again, her smile looking a little strained now. The session clearly hadn't gone the way she'd planned. She was expecting an emotional reaction, arguments, something she could manage and control. She didn't get one. She got nothing. "Thank you," she said, trying to sound cheerful. Now, to conclude our session and solidify our commitment to these important values, we will proceed with the signing of the Pledge of Allyship. An assistant walked around the room, placing a freshly printed copy of the pledge and a nice ballpoint pen in front of every man. The documents lay on the table, stark white against the dark wood. The air grew even thicker. This was the moment, the culmination of her entire strategy. She had lectured us, tried to shame us, and now she was presenting the demand. Sign on the dotted line. Bend the knee. She stood at the front, beaming as if she were presiding over a historic treaty signing. "I will give everyone a few moments to read it over one last time," she said, her voice full of false magnanimity. "And then we can begin the signing." She looked directly at me. I was the senior person on the most senior team. She was going to start with me. She thought if I signed, everyone else would fall in line. I picked up the single sheet of paper. I didn't need to read it. I already knew what it said. I looked at the words. Unearned privilege. Amplify marginalized voices. Intent versus impact. It wasn't just paper. It was an instrument of control, a written record of my submission, a tool that could be used against me at any point in the future. Across the table, Emmett hadn't even touched his copy. He was just staring straight ahead at Liliana, his expression completely blank. To my left, Yosef was reading his copy, but not like a person reading a letter. He was reading it like a lawyer examining a hostile contract, his eyes scanning for every trap, every ambiguity, every weaponized phrase. The seconds ticked by in heavy silence. Liliana's smile began to falter. This was taking too long. It was supposed to be a formality. She cleared her throat. "All right, everyone. Shall we begin? Kai, if you would do us the honor of being the first to sign." Every eye in the room turned to me. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze. The other guys on my team, the men from other departments, Liliana, her consultant. Her smile was frozen on her face, an expression of supreme confidence. She believed she had me cornered. In her world, a public demand for conformity was a checkmate. To refuse was to declare yourself a pariah. I let the silence hang in the air for a few more seconds. I looked down at the paper, then back up at her. I made sure my expression was neutral, professional, not angry, not scared, just analytical. I placed the pen on the table, next to the document. I did not pick it up. "Liliana," I said, my voice calm and level, "I'm afraid I can't sign this." A collective, silent gasp seemed to go through the room. Her smile twitched, just for a fraction of a second. The mask slipped. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a little sharper. "Could you repeat that?" "I won't be signing this document," I repeated, just as calmly. "And I have a few professional questions about its implementation, if you don't mind." She was not expecting this. She was expecting a quiet, compliant signature. "This isn't a forum for questions, Kai," she said, trying to regain control. "This is a statement of our company's core values." "I understand," I said, "and one of our company's core values is performance based on merit. My first question is about this clause here." I tapped the paper. The part about stepping back to amplify marginalized voices. Our project management methodology relies on the free and rapid exchange of ideas. The best idea wins, regardless of the source. How do we reconcile that with a policy that mandates we deliberately withhold input based on the identity of the speaker? It seems counter to the efficiency that makes our department profitable. My argument was framed entirely in the language of the business. Profitability, efficiency, methodology, words she couldn't easily dismiss. "It's about being a team player," she retorted, her voice losing its cheerful edge. "It's about creating a balanced conversation." "We already have a balanced conversation," I replied smoothly. "It's balanced by competence. Yosef is our data expert. When he speaks about data, we all listen. Emmett is our strategy expert. When he speaks about strategy, we listen. This document asks us to replace that system of merit with a system of identity. I need to understand, from a business process perspective, how that's an improvement." She stared at me, her eyes narrowing. She was realizing this wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated professional challenge. Before she could formulate a response, Yosef cleared his throat. He had been waiting for his moment. "If I may," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I also have a concern, purely from a legal and compliance standpoint." Liliana's head snapped towards him. "And you are?" "Yosef, I'm a data analyst," he said, "and I'm looking at the clause that states, I acknowledge that my intent is secondary to my impact. As written, this is a legally perilous admission for any employee to sign." He had her full attention now. The word legal has a special power in a corporate environment. "This clause," Yosef continued, "effectively creates a new, subjective standard for professional conduct, where the emotional response of any individual can supersede both the signed employee's intent and established company policy. For example, if I provide critical feedback on a project, which is part of my job, and a colleague feels that my feedback had a negative impact on them, does this signed document become evidence against me in an HR dispute? Does it create a liability for the company by establishing a conduct standard that is impossible to consistently define or enforce?" He didn't sound angry. He sounded like he was genuinely trying to solve a logical problem. He had weaponized his analytical mind and aimed it directly at the flimsy legal framework of her pledge. Liliana was visibly flustered. "You're overthinking it," she snapped. "This is a document of goodwill, not a legal contract." "With all due respect," Yosef said, not missing a beat, Every document an employee is required to sign as a condition of their role has legal weight. To suggest otherwise is professionally negligent. I cannot sign something that could put me or the company in a compromising legal position based on such vague and subjective language. Checkmate. He had used her own corporate buzzwords against her. Liability, compliance, negligence. A low murmur went through the room. Other guys were nodding slowly. Yosef had given them a professional, logical reason to refuse. It wasn't about feelings. It was about risk. Liliana looked around the room, a desperate, almost pleading look in her eyes. She was losing the audience. She needed to shut this down. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "This is about creating a better, more respectful workplace. It's about showing our female colleagues that we stand with them." That's when Emmett decided to speak. He hadn't moved a muscle this entire time. He hadn't even looked at his copy of the pledge. He slowly, deliberately, pushed the sheet of paper towards the center of the table with the back of his hand, like it was a piece of trash. "Respect," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "You want to talk about respect for our female colleagues? Then let's talk about it. For the last 20 years, I've worked alongside the women in this company. We've closed deals together. We've solved problems together. We've built this company together. Respect is treating them as competent professionals. It's judging their work by the same high standard we judge everyone else's. That's real respect." He paused and leaned forward slightly. "This piece of paper," he said, his voice laced with contempt, "is not respect. This is condescension. It assumes that the women in this office are helpless children who need us to sign a piece of paper to amplify their voices. It's an insult to them, and it's an insult to us. It reduces our entire professional relationship to a patronizing gesture. We're not signing it." That was it. The final nail in the coffin. He had completely reframed the argument. He had taken her core premise, that this was for the benefit of women, and exposed it as a demeaning, disrespectful farce. Liliana's face went from pale to beet red. She had lost. All three of her main targets had dismantled her initiative from three different angles: business practicality, legal liability, and true professional respect. And then, the final act of defiance began. One by one, the other men in the room began to follow Emmett's lead. Silently, calmly, each man placed his pen on the table. Each man pushed his copy of the pledge toward the center. There were no speeches, no angry words, just a quiet, unified, and absolute rejection. It was a wave of silent resistance, spreading from our table to the rest of the room. Liliana watched, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had expected a few grumbles. She had expected maybe one or two difficult individuals whom she could isolate and discipline. She had never, in her wildest dreams, expected all of them, united, calm, and completely immovable. The sight of 24 unsigned pledges and 24 pens lying untouched on the table broke her. Her professional demeanor, already cracked, shattered completely. "Fine!" she yelled, her voice shrill and echoing in the silent room. "Fine! If you all want to cling to your fragile masculinity, that's your choice." Her expert consultant looked horrified and tried to subtly signal for her to calm down. But it was too late. "I cannot believe this level of hostility," Liliana continued, her voice trembling with rage. "This is exactly the kind of toxic behavior this workshop was designed to address. You are proving my point for me." She was pointing a shaking finger at us now. "This is insubordination, all of you. You think this is over? This is going in your permanent records. I am taking this to the partners. We'll see how brave you are when your jobs are on the line." And then she just stood there, breathing heavily, her face flushed, her eyes darting around the room at the sea of calm, unimpressed faces. The contrast was devastating. Her hysterical, emotional outburst against our wall of quiet professionalism. Nobody said a word. We just sat there and let her tirade burn itself out. After a few more seconds of heavy, awkward silence, she seemed to realize what she had done. She had completely lost her composure in front of 30 employees. She grabbed her notes from the lectern, turned on her heel without another word, and stormed out of the conference room, her consultant scurrying after her. The meeting was over. We all just sat there for a moment, the spell of the confrontation slowly breaking. Then, quietly, we all stood up and filed out of the room, leaving the pile of unsigned pledges in the middle of the tables. The walk back to our desks was surreal. The rest of the office was quiet, people pretending to be absorbed in their work, but obviously aware that something major had just happened. The air was buzzing. My team sat down at our desks. Nobody spoke about it. We just opened our laptops and went back to work. Or tried to. The threat of her taking it to the partners hung in the air. Had we won the battle, but were about to lose the war? An hour later, an email from my A partner's assistant appeared in my inbox. Subject: meeting. The body was simple. The senior partners would like to meet with you and Liliana in the main boardroom tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The summons had arrived. The next morning, I walked into the main boardroom. It was one of those old-school rooms with a massive dark oak table and leather chairs. On the walls were framed photos of the company's biggest projects, monuments to results and achievement. Liliana was already there, sitting on one side of the table. She looked composed, her professional mask back in place, but her eyes were cold and hard. At the head of the table sat the firm's senior partner. He was a man in his late 60s, one of the original founders who Emmett had worked with back in the garage days. He was a legend in the industry, a man who cared about exactly two things: the quality of the work and the number on the bottom line. He was not a man who had any time for nonsense. He nodded at me as I sat down opposite Liliana. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense authority. "I've read Liliana's report on yesterday's workshop, a very dramatic report. It describes a coordinated act of insubordination and the creation of a hostile work environment. It recommends disciplinary action against every man in that session. Now, Kai, I'd like to hear your version. Keep it brief." I took a breath. "There was no insubordination," I said calmly. "There was a professional disagreement. We were asked to sign a document that we believed was poorly conceived, legally problematic, and contrary to the company's established principles of meritocracy." I then quickly and concisely laid out the three main objections we had raised. My point about business efficiency, Yosef's point about legal liability, and Emmett's point about the gesture being condescending rather than respectful. I kept it factual and emotion-free. The partner listened intently, his fingers steepled in front of him. He didn't interrupt. When I was finished, he turned to Liliana. "Liliana," he said, "your report claims the men were hostile. Kai's description sounds like a business discussion. Which was it?" "It was their tone," she insisted. "It was a coordinated attack on my authority. They were using legalese and business jargon to mask their refusal to engage with the important themes of the workshop. It's a classic tactic of deflecting and derailing." The partner raised an eyebrow. "So, they raised valid business and legal concerns, and you interpreted that as hostility." "They were resisting," she said, her voice starting to rise again. "They were resisting progress. They refused to acknowledge their privilege." "This firm doesn't pay people based on their privilege, Liliana," the partner said, his voice turning icy. "We pay them to solve problems for our clients. Kai's team is the most profitable unit in this entire company. Their efficiency is based on a culture of ruthless meritocracy, which you seem to be trying to dismantle." He picked up a copy of the pledge. "I've read this document," he said. "Our legal counsel has also read it this morning. Their opinion," he paused, letting the words sink in, "is that Yosef's analysis was, and I quote, 100% correct. They advised that having employees sign this would be a monumental and unnecessary legal liability." Liliana's face went completely white. "You put this company at risk," the partner continued, his voice low and dangerous. "You did so without consulting legal and without any thought to the impact on our most valuable employees. You alienated an entire department, not with a well-reasoned business proposal, but with an ideological loyalty test. You then lost your composure and threatened them when they calmly refused to comply. Your report was not a professional assessment, it was an emotional tirade." He tossed the pledge onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of her. "Your synergistic allyship initiative is canceled. Effective immediately," he said with an air of finality. "You will retract your report and you will send an apology to the entire department for your unprofessional conduct. Your duties will, from now on, be restricted to payroll, benefits, and recruitment. You are to launch no new initiatives of any kind without my explicit written approval. Am I understood?" Liliana just sat there, completely stunned, her mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. She looked utterly defeated. She finally managed a small, choked nod. "Good," the partner said. He then looked at me. "Kai, thank you for your time, and thank your team for their professionalism and their commitment to the company's best interests. Now, get back to work." I stood up, nodded to the partner, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving Liliana sitting there alone with the useless pledge. An hour later, a short email from her arrived. It was a stilted formal apology for any miscommunication during the workshop. The pledge was never mentioned again. Liliana became a ghost in the office. We'd see her in the hallways, and she would immediately stare at the floor and walk faster. Her authority was gone. She was just a functionary, a name on the HR masthead. Nothing changed for us. We just kept working. We hit our Q3 targets. We landed a new client. The machine kept running, smoothly and efficiently. A few weeks after the incident, Emmett, Yosef, and I found ourselves riding the elevator down together at the end of a long day. We stood in silence for a few floors. Then Emmett looked over at me and gave a single slow nod. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. I nodded back. Yosef saw the exchange and nodded too. Nothing needed to be said. We hadn't fought aggression with aggression. We had fought ideology with logic. We had fought collective guilt with individual integrity. And we had done it together. We simply refused to sign. And in the end, that was enough.